Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. The biggest development today is the reshaping of Ukraine's military leadership, with President Volodymyr Zelensky replacing Commander-in-Chief General Alexander Syrsky with Major General Mykhailo Drapatyi. This is a major personnel decision, but the real story is what it says about the direction Ukraine believes it needs to take as the war enters another demanding phase. Drapatyi represents a younger generation of Ukrainian commanders focused on adapting the military for the kind of warfare being fought today. Drones everywhere, rapidly changing technology, data-driven decisions, and a much faster cycle between innovation and battlefield application. The change comes after political turbulence inside Kyiv following Zelensky's decision to remove Defense Minister Mykhailo Fedorov. That move triggered protests and opened a broader debate about how Ukraine's defense establishment should evolve. The issue was never simply one individual general. It was a debate over whether Ukraine's military needed more institutional reform and technological transformation. Syrsky leaves behind a complicated record. He was central to Ukraine's defense of Kyiv, the successful Kharkiv counteroffensive, and the 2024 Kursk operation. But he also faced criticism from some military personnel and analysts who argued his command style was too traditional and that Ukraine needed a different approach to managing manpower and battlefield adaptation. Zelensky is clearly trying to answer that criticism without disrupting the war effort. Drapatyi's first major challenge will be balancing reform with continuity. Ukraine still has to hold the front line, maintain international confidence, and convince its own population that the military leadership is adapting fast enough. That emphasis on adaptation also connects to Ukraine's broader strategy, making Russia feel the cost of the war far beyond the battlefield. An update from what we've been watching is the continued expansion of Ukraine's long-range pressure campaign inside Russia. Kyiv is increasingly targeting systems that support the war effort, especially energy infrastructure, logistics networks, and industrial facilities. The objective is not just destroying individual sites. It is forcing Moscow to spend more resources defending areas it once considered relatively secure. One of the clearest examples is Russia's fuel situation. Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries have created significant strain in the country's energy system. Moscow has responded by redirecting fuel supplies from Siberia and other regions, increasing imports from Belarus, and bringing in additional supplies from abroad. The Kremlin has managed to stabilize conditions around Moscow, which remains the highest priority because of its political importance. But the picture is very different elsewhere. Occupied Crimea has faced some of the most visible disruptions, including fuel restrictions and economic impacts. The interesting part here is the strategic dilemma it creates for Russia. Every additional facility that requires protection creates another demand on Moscow's resources. Air defenses, security forces, logistics, and money all have to be spread across a much larger area. Ukraine has also expanded its targeting approach into parts of Russia's consumer economy. Recent drone strikes against Wildberries warehouses, one of Russia's largest online retailers, highlight that shift. Ukrainian officials say these logistics hubs were connected to supplying Russian forces with drone components, navigation equipment, and other dual-use goods. Russia disputes that claim, but the broader significance is that the war is increasingly affecting commercial infrastructure and ordinary economic activity. Wildberries is a major part of Russia's digital economy. The strikes injured workers, disrupted operations, and affected independent sellers who rely on the platform. That creates a different kind of pressure than a battlefield loss. It introduces the war into the daily routines of people who may have previously experienced the conflict as something happening far away. On the diplomatic front, there are several important developments. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is preparing to meet Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov during an ASEAN gathering. Rubio said Washington remains interested in finding a path toward ending the war, but acknowledged that previous discussions with Moscow have produced limited progress. At the same time, European governments are trying to balance continued pressure on Russia with concerns about the long-term cost of sanctions. The European Union is working on another sanctions package, but some proposed measures have been weakened or removed because of disagreements among member states. That debate is exactly the kind of political pressure Moscow has hoped sanctions would create. Russia's strategy has long depended on the idea that Western unity could eventually weaken as economic costs accumulate. There are also signs that some European governments are keeping diplomatic channels open. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev said Russian and German figures recently held discussions in Baku. The details remain unclear, but the meeting reflects a broader European effort to understand whether any diplomatic openings exist. Meanwhile, Russia and China continue increasing military cooperation in ways designed to challenge U.S. allies. Chinese and Russian naval forces recently conducted exercises near Japan, including live fire activity by Chinese ships near Japan's exclusive economic zone. Tokyo protested the activity, arguing it created unnecessary risks for commercial shipping. The larger issue is not one individual exercise, it is the pattern. China and Russia are becoming more comfortable operating together in areas important to U.S. partners. They are not a formal military alliance, but their cooperation gives both countries advantages. China gains insight from Russia's battlefield experience in Ukraine, while Russia benefits from Chinese industrial capacity and technology. Russia is also continuing activities closer to NATO territory. Poland has warned that Moscow could use captured Ukrainian drones in future false flag operations against NATO members. Separately, a Russian frigate conducted a live fire exercise near the British coast. The activity occurred legally in international waters, but British officials described the location and circumstances as provocative. Inside Russia, the pressure on the state itself is becoming another area to watch. The Kremlin continues tightening domestic controls, including expanding the legal grounds for deporting migrants who violate broad categories of laws and regulations. Analysts assess this could provide another mechanism for increasing pressure on migrants to join the military at a time when recruitment remains a challenge. There are also continuing questions about the health of Russia's military institutions. A former Russian Airborne Forces sergeant who fled the country described problems inside his unit, including inflated personnel reporting, corruption, weak information security practices, and significant losses. The claims are difficult to independently verify, but they provide another glimpse into the administrative strain created by a prolonged war. Russia is also trying to adapt financially. Moscow has now created a regulated cryptocurrency system that allows companies to use digital assets for international transactions while keeping tight government oversight. The goal is clear: create more options for operating around Western financial pressure. The picture emerging is a conflict that continues to expand beyond trenches and front lines. Ukraine is trying to make the war increasingly expensive for Russia, economically, politically, and psychologically. Russia is trying to prove it can absorb those costs, control domestic pressure, and maintain enough international partnerships to keep going. The question moving forward is not simply who can win the next battle. It is which side can better manage the growing demands of a long-term confrontation. You've made it through another episode. Go do something kind, read something inconvenient, and keep a close eye on anyone who says they alone can save the country. The written brief is at restrictedhandling.substack.com.